All right, so I'm going to seek the game, and we are about to get paired. My current rating is 1330. We're playing at 1273. Let's jump in, folks. Okay, so e4. We play e5 on the speedrun. Right now I'm playing kind of the most basic openings, and in chess the most basic openings are the ones where you essentially copy your opponent's move. e4, e5, or d4, d5. Knight f3. Okay, so we of course play knight c6 and bishop b5. This is the Ruy Lopez, also known as the Spanish game. This move right here is the most popular opening at the highest levels of chess. It's been around for over 500 years. In fact, it's named after a priest who lived in the 1500s, who was really the first, not the first to mention this opening in chess literature, but the first to sort of extol the virtues of bishop e5. Now, those of you new to chess, what white is doing here is developing their pieces. In the opening stage of the game, you have to get your pieces out of their initial positions and put them on squares where they are essentially doing something. As to what that something is, well, there's a lot of things that pieces could be doing. They could be attacking the king, which is ultimately the goal of chess, but they could be doing a bunch of other stuff, that like putting pressure on pawns. And that is what this bishop is doing. It's putting pressure on the knight. The knight is defending the pawn, and so in an indirect way, white is putting pressure on the pawn. Now, we are going to follow the main line of the Ruy Lopez. We are going to play the move a6 to chase the bishop away from b5. Now white has to decide, is he going to take on c6, or is he going to drop the bishop back to a4? Bishop takes c6 is called the exchange variation. And those of you from Charlie's channel who are, new to chess, you might be wondering, wait a second, what happens if white takes the knight, we take back, and then white grabs this pawn with his knight, right? Aren't we blundering a pawn? Well, as I've showed before, this is actually a trap, and a lot of beginner players aren't aware of it. He does take on c6, which is a legitimate move, but let's see if white follows up by taking this pawn on e5. So which pawn do we take with? Yeah, queen d4, very good. Which pawn do we take with here? Well, in order for us to be able to play queen d4, in order for us to be able to move this queen out to d4, we have to take with the d-pawn. Now, there is a rule that you should usually take toward the center. I think that rule is highly overrated, but you're often taught that when you recapture a piece with a pawn, you want to do it in the direction of the center, which would be b takes c6. But you always have to weigh the pros and cons of a move. Even if a move, quote-unquote, follows the rules, that doesn't mean it's necessarily good. What d takes c6 does is that it opens up the bishop, which allows us to more quickly develop that bishop to an active square. And more importantly, it takes the sting out of knight takes c5 because we bring our queen up to d4, and as I'll show after the game. And again, those of you new to the speedrun, after the game, I basically go through all of the moves. I answer everybody's questions, and I talk about some of the important things that didn't happen because I don't expect everybody to just visualize stuff in your head. And to our opponent's credit, he knows not to take the pawn. He castles. He castles. And now, of course, we have to do something about the e5 pawn, which is now hanging. Knight takes e5 is now a threat. We have to defend this pawn. We have many ways of defending it. Many, many different ways. We can defend it directly with a move like f6 or bishop d6. And we can also defend it indirectly with the move bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. All of these are legitimate moves. And I am going to play the move that really is the old main line. This is the move that throughout chess history has been considered to be the most solid response to the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez, and that is the move f6. And I know, never play f6. This violates the sort of very basic rules of chess development, because not only does, is Ben Feingold cringing, but also, where is this knight going to go? Do we just not care about developing our knight? Well, that's why I'm playing this move, because I want to explain a couple of specific properties of this position that make the move f6 not only possible, but also quite effective. Now, d4 is the correct move, and this is an important moment. This is an important moment. If we take on d4, right, we are essentially playing into white's hands because we're opening up the center. And because we played this move f6, right? And you should be understanding this even if you're a total beginner, right? When you play a move like f6, you are physically weakening the position of your king. In addition, we have not yet developed a single one of our pieces. The piece that we did develop has been exchanged, which means that it is quite important to keep the center as closed down as possible. Or, better yet, it would be very nice if we could trade queens, because by trading queens, you're making it less likely that your opponent is going to checkmate you. So, what should we do here? Who can tell me the best move for black? And it's a move that I just mentioned a move ago. Now it's time for bishop g4. Now we get our bishop out to g4. The idea is that we pin the knight. And when I say pin, a pin is a situation where you have a piece such as a bishop, usually a bishop, and the bishop pins the knight on f3, which means that the knight cannot move because behind the knight stands a more valuable piece. Okay, c3. That is also a good move. Had white taken on e5, we would have traded queens and then recaptured, and I'll talk a little bit about this endgame after the game. The move c3 reinforces the d4 pawn. And now what we have to do with black is develop our pieces, right? Again, there's nothing extraordinary that we can do, but we do have a really cool move here, which I remember analyzing. The main line, what most people play is bishop d6. What most people play is bishop d6, and that's what we're going to do as well, because in the speedrun, we try to play solid, simple chess, but bishop d6 is not the move that I actually play in my over-the-board games. I will show the move that I play after the game. All right, thank you for the sub, Manlik Wavy. Knight bd2. All right, so our opponent continues playing very well. He continues to develop his pieces, and we should continue to develop our pieces. So what move am I talking about? What does it mean for us to develop our pieces here? Well, we need to develop the knight from g8. That's our last remaining piece that is preventing us from castling. Knight h6 looks pretty awkward. You don't usually want to develop your knights to the rim. You want to develop your knights toward the center, and so we go knight e7. And so we go knight e7. Yeah, our opponent is playing all of the top theoretical moves. So we'll see at what point he deviates h3. Now, when you're a beginner, there's often a temptation to trade pieces when you have the chance. So a lot of people are thinking, well, we should take the knight on f3. But there's actually no need to take the knight on f3, because this bishop on g4, right, I mentioned that it was pinning white's knight on f3 to the queen. So this is a pretty valuable bishop. And so we can simply drop our bishop back to h5, preserving the pin against the knight. Remember that retreating moves are never inherently bad just because they're retreating moves. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. In this case, it is perfectly acceptable to play bishop h5. Now, again, as a beginner, you might be looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute. What if white plays pawn to g4? What if white chases that bishop away? Well, a move like g4 is a move where you push a pawn in front of your own king. And when you push pawns in front of your own king, the king becomes more exposed, and those pawns become easier to attack. So g4 would be playing right into our hands. All right, so DE we simply take back with the f-pawn. And I think here queen b3 is the theoretical move. If I'm not mistaken, I already don't know the theory here. So let's see what our opponent does. Knight c4 is also very good. All right. Well, let's figure out what to do in this position. The problem that I'm seeing is that, oh, well, there's no problem. I think we just castle. And we are not blundering our bishop because our c7 pawn is guarding that bishop on d6. All right. So far, I think we're still following mainline theory. Now, what's happening here in this position? What's going on? Well, you might notice that by castling, we're exerting more pressure on the rook, on the knight on f3. And in fact, we were still pitting that knight, but queen b3 is a very powerful move. What it does is that it sets up an x-ray against our king. The second thing that it does is that it unpins the knight, which means that the knight can now move without fear of losing white's queen. Now, what is our top priority here? Well, our priority is to get rid of this x-ray. And x-ray leads to a discovered check in many cases. White is threatening to take on d6 with a knight, and that will be checked. That's a devastating check. So you might say, well, let's move our king to h8. But that doesn't address the second problem. He's going to take on e5 in that case. The question then becomes, can we address both problems at the same time? Can we cut into the x-ray while also protecting the pawn on e5? And the answer is yes. We can bring our bishop back to f7. The problem with this move is that he has the move knight g5 in response, which is very strong. We will see if he plays it. But the point is that, yes, he does play it. But I have an idea here. I have an idea. I think that... Oh, wait a minute. There. There. Thank you, Spaceship Trucker. Appreciate it. Okay. Let me think, folks. I have to remember the theory. So what is the purpose of knight g5? The purpose of knight g5 is to immediately contest the bishop on f7. If we take the knight on c4, then he's going to take back with a queen. And that combination of the queen and the knight is going to be very devastating. So we need to be the ones to allow white to take our bishop. And we somehow have to defend the pawn on b7. I honestly don't remember what the top move is here. What comes to mind for me is the move b5. What comes to mind for me is the move b5. Attacking the knight and forcing him to take the bishop on f7. Folks, simmer down on the cheating accusations. If I get suspicious, as I say every time, I will share with you the moment that I become suspicious, I will be honest about it. But there's no need to just say, 500 times that he's cheating. One way or another, we're going to determine that after the game. And it's important to give people the benefit of the doubt during the game. Okay, so rook takes f7, recapturing the knight. By the way, notice that if we would have taken the other knight, he takes the queen on d8, and then we take his queen, and then he escapes via e6. So he plays knight takes d6. Now, which piece should we capture with? Should we take with the queen, or should we take with the pawn? We should definitely take with the pawn. And the reason why is that we need to improve our pawn structure. What does it mean to improve your pawn structure? Well, if you look at this position, the pawn on e5 is not surrounded by any other pawns, right? They're all alone, and that's called an isolated pawn. And you want to try to avoid isolated pawns when possible. And so by taking on d6 with a pawn, you are essentially connecting these two pawns. You're making sure that the e5 pawn is well protected. And at this point, I still think that this is probably common theory. I would be concerned about the move a4 here. Okay, queen e6. Queen e6 is also a pretty dangerous move. He gets right into our grill. And he's probably going to follow up with the move rook d1. He's probably going to follow up with the move rook d1, attacking the pawn on d6. So what we need to do is we need to immediately activate this rook on a8 and prepare to get it to d8 in order to protect the pawn on d6. We cannot move our rook. We cannot move our rook because the rook is pinned. So I would play queen c7 here. I don't love our position. I think I did something wrong. What worries me is if he goes rook d1 and then he induces rook d8 and then at some point white goes a4. At some point, white might go a4 and try to open up a second front. Let's see what he does. So I'll be honest, whether or not I'm suspicious is going to be determined in the next couple of moves. Right now, I feel like it's totally plausible that he knew all of this theory. If he goes a4 here, I'll be a little bit sus, but with that being said, that does not mean I'm accusing him of cheating or anything of the sort. Okay, so a4 is a very strong move because it opens up the a file. And why is opening up the a file a good idea? Because our rook has left the a file, which means that if white trades pawns on b5, he's going to have an uncontested open file for his rook. By the way, I hope I'm explaining things relatively clearly. There's a lot to talk about, and this game has been played on a pretty high level. So if you're a beginner, I hope that it hasn't been too overwhelming. After the game, I'll talk about some of the concepts in more rudimentary detail. Okay. And he goes b3. b3. Now, that is not a move that struck me as particularly scary. But I guess it makes sense. I think White's idea is to get this bishop to a3 and continue to pressure the d6 pawn. Now, the thing is, I feel like we should trade queens here. I really feel like we should get this queen out of the way, right? Off of e6. And we can force a queen trade. How can we force a queen trade? How can we force a queen trade? Yeah, so not queen c8. If we go queen c8, we relinquish our control of the d6 pawn. He can take the pawn with the rook. So we have to go queen d7. This keeps the d6 pawn protected, and it offers a queen trade, which White cannot refuse because White's queen simply has no squares. Thank you for the bits. Okay, so takes. And I'm anticipating bishop a3 here or a4. a4 would be particularly annoying here, now that we're in the endgame and my pawns are kind of weak. Let's see what happens. Why not queen b6? Well, because, oh, there's a4. All right. Well, let's think. Let's think. So why is a4 a good move? Let's deconstruct what's going on here. White wants to take on b5, and then that rook's going to have a wide open a file, and the rook can move to a6 or a8 and put a lot of pressure on our position. Now, there's nothing I can do about it, because taking the pawn on a4, it makes matters even worse. He takes with the rook, and then we're going to have a tremendously weak pawn on a6, which we simply cannot defend. So what we have to do is try to improve our position, right? We have to make some sort of a neutral move. And one thing that we could try to do is a move like rook f8 in order to preemptively prevent White's rook from getting to a8. Does that make sense? After he takes on b5, we're trying to cover a couple of crucial squares with our rooks, a7 and a8. He goes bishop a3. Not the move I was expecting, but it also makes sense. He attacks the pawn on d6. We go, whoa, we don't want to pre-move that. We go rook f d8. We defend the pawn. And our next two moves are going to be to bring that king all the way to e6 and overprotect the d6 pawn. He goes c4. Feel like he's going off the rails just a little bit. c4. c4. All right. Well, do we have to do anything? Do we have to react to this move? Should we take? Should we take? Well, there's a pro and a con to taking, right? If we trade, the issue that I'm seeing is that it opens up the b file for White. And rook b1, rook b6 becomes a very nasty idea. So what I would do is leave the pawn on b5 and let him be the one to take everything. But from a third perspective, that allows White to open the a file. I actually think c4 is a tremendous move. I want to make a waiting move, but I want to make a healthy waiting move. I don't just want to go h6. If we're making a waiting move, I want to bring my king up to e6. I can't really decide whether it's a good idea to take on c4 or not. Maybe takes on c4 and then c5 makes sense. But then again, he goes rook b1 and tries to get the rook to b6. That looks very nasty. All right. Let's go king f7. Let's see what he does. What I'm worried about here is a trade on b5 and then, well, we'll see what he does after that. The immediate bishop b4 also looks pretty scary. All right. Yeah, this has been a good game. I think that black is fine. I don't think that I'm in mortal danger of losing the game just yet. Okay, so takes. We take toward the center here in this case. Now, we don't want to take with the c pawn because then the a6 pawn remains in the line of fire of the rook. It doesn't matter because at the end of the day, we traded everything. And let's see what White comes up with here. Let's see what White comes up with here. There's no question that he's playing on the level of a GM so far, but I would also say that most of his moves have been not obvious, but definitely findable. And it doesn't seem to me that he's played necessarily the top move so far. I'm not getting that kind of sense. The moves have been findable. The other thing is, if he goes bishop b4 here, then we can swing the knight out to c6 and chase that bishop away. He goes rook c1. That's a good move. Let's go king e6. Let's centralize our king. It's the endgame. The endgame is a loosely defined term, which means the final stage of the game. Generally, it's when queens are off the board and there's only a couple of pieces remaining for each side. And in the endgame, because there are no queens on the board, you have to activate your king. All right, so he goes bishop b4. And we're definitely worse. I mean, no question that black is worse here. We got to be careful. So what ideas could we propose here? Well, what is the idea of bishop b4? Maybe he'll go back to a1 and then a6. So one idea is to move this rook to a8 and beat him to the punch. I actually think that's what we're going to do. Let's go rook a8. Now notice that, you know, we're keeping this rook on the a file. We're keeping this other rook as a defending piece because we cannot afford to lose the d6 pawn. I do have an idea so far. I do have an idea. And the idea is to chase the bishop away from b4. Who can propose this idea? Who sees a way that you can prepare to chase the bishop away from b4? Yeah, but you can't play knight c6 immediately. You can't play this move immediately. You can't play this move immediately. What do we start with? Why? Because it blunders the knight. His rook on c1 guards the square. So we have to play rook a6. That was my idea. And then follow up with knight c6. Rook a6. And then knight c6. And that bishop is going to be chased away from b4. I actually think that we're playing this very well. King h2. Wow. Okay. Well, let's follow our plan. I mean, I don't understand these moves. h3, king h2 is like strange. It doesn't even seem that scary. I honestly just don't get it. Okay, now we're making progress. We're making progress. We're making progress. How should we continue here? So a couple of you are suggesting b4. I don't understand why you're so attracted to b4 before he drops the bishop back to b2. No, rather I would target this pawn immediately. Let's target the pawn on b3. Let's get that pawn. Now some of you might say, wait a minute, there's an x-ray on the knight on c6. Can't white play bishop b2 simultaneously hitting the rook and then hitting the knight on c6? Well, what's black's response there? What happens after bishop b2? Yeah, the rook takes the pawn. Bishop b2, the rook takes the pawn. And if the rook takes the knight, then we can take the bishop on b2 and we merge a pawn up. b4. Okay, well, I'm not done hunting for that pawn on b3. And very often in the endgame, there will be situations where you have essentially two ways to do the same thing. And we have rook a4 and we have rook b3. Well, I see what I think he wants to do. Ooh. There's a detail here that I missed. If rook b3 has got rook d5. Oh, but then we can maybe play rook b7. Then we can maybe play rook b7. Let's give it a shot. Let's see what he has in mind. Why is rook d5 scary? Because it attacks the pawn on b5. And so if we play knight takes b4, then rook takes b5, and our knight is then going to be pinned to the rook on b3. But after rook d5, we can, if we want to, defend the pawn on b5 with a move rook b7. The drawback of that move is that it leaves the d6 pawn now without a defender. But the white rook will not be able to leave c1 because the bishop on c3 is going to be hanging. King g3. Okay, this is a strange move. I think our opponent might be losing the thread of the game. Obviously, we take the pawn on b4. This still should be a draw. The game should still end in a draw, even though we're a pawn up, because we've got a bunch of weaknesses in our position. This pawn is weak. White's rooks are active, but now we have an extra pawn, and the way he's been playing the last couple of moves, I feel like we might be able to grind this out. Yeah, we'll take a look after the game with an engine to see like what was going on. Now, what should be the strategy in this position? It's still a draw. I mean, if white is careful, then he should be able to make a draw without problems. And rook d5 is excellent. Yeah, I mean, we have to push the passer. Now, we can't push it because the rook is on b4. We have to move the rook out of the way. Now, where should we move it? And this is where a tricky moment occurs. Because if you move the rook to b2, you're going to get a situation where once the pawn advances to b3, again, we're going to have the same issue. The rook on b2 is going to be in the way of the pawn. Does that make sense? So we need to use tactics and use our creativity to figure out a way where we can somehow get this rook off of the b file so that the pawn has a clear path forward. So I came up with the move rook b7 first, but that move doesn't work. And that's the brilliance of how he's playing, because he goes rook to c6 and hits the pawn on d6, forcing a rook back. A lot of you are suggesting rook c4. I thought of that move initially, but that leads to a draw. Because he goes rook b1. Let's test him on this. Rook b2 is a much more straightforward draw. Let's see whether he finds this. And he does. Rook b1. We go b4. It looks like we're home free, but no, we're not. He goes rook b5, and he picks up the pawn on b4. And the result of this is a dead drawn endgame, which I will try to win, because maybe he will, let's say, let his guard down a little bit. And we will see if that leads us anywhere good. Okay, so this is the draw. This is a 4-on-4. All right, guys, relax. Everybody relax. We will analyze the game with the computer, and we will determine whether he's sus or not. So nobody needs to freak out at the moment, okay? Now, this is a draw. But in fact, if I were playing this with white, I would prefer white, just because we have a slightly discombobulated pawn structure. We can offer a draw here, or we can just make a couple of moves. Let's see. Let's go rook c7. I'll offer a draw. And that draw offer is accepted. That was a very well played game. Now, I see in his game history that he has wins and losses against 1200s. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check the accuracy, and I'm going to look at the accuracy. The accuracy might not be as high as we think it is. It was very high. It was 95 to 95. Let's see some of the key moves. Now, how do I determine, and maybe we'll use this as a window to looking at, for me explaining to you guys how I would go about testing a game, let's say if I'm suspicious of it. So, am I suspicious? Yes. I mean, I'm definitely suspicious. 1200s don't usually play, to this quality, but that there's a difference between being suspicious and then accusing somebody of cheating, which should not be done without very clear-cut evidence. And that evidence can come in the form of comparing the game with the engine analysis, which we're going to do right now. Okay. So, it was an exchange roux Lopez. And what I just wanted to show you guys is that if white plays knight takes e5 here, particularly those of you who are new to chess, there's a very important detail, which is that black has queen d4. This is a fork. A fork is essentially an attack against two pieces or more. And the knight has to move. White has to save the knight, and then we take the pawn, and that's also a check. And not only is that a check, no, queen e7 is not better. Not only is that a check, It's a check that forces white to lose castling rights, either to move the king to f1, which is yucky, or better, to play queen e2, king e2. And again, black has 2 bishops, which is really good. White has only 1 bishop, and black is better here. I mean, black is slightly better. It's just a great position. The king is weak. So just remember this if you're an e5 player. Okay, so he played castles, which is the main line. f6, d4, bishop g4, c3. Now, notice that this engine suggests queen e7. That is the move which I actually play myself. Queen e7, in my opinion, is the best move. It's showing an advantage for white, but take that with a grain of salt. I think the black is fine in this line. Okay. So, essentially, we played bishop d6, which is the old school move. Defending the pawn on e5. And let's just start by running the game with an engine and seeing whether he played like an engine in critical moments. So knight b2, knight e7. h3 is top, bishop h5. And what we're looking for is we're looking at the top 2 suggestions. If he plays within the top 2 or even within the top 3 suggestions for the whole game, yeah, that's suspicious. d5 top, knight c4 top. And here, okay, queen b3 appears as the top move. Knight g5 is obvious. I mean, this I don't really fault him for. Takes. Now he played the move queen e6, which was briefly in the list. Yeah, now it's number 3. So definitely a good move, but maybe not necessarily the best move. Queen c7, rook d1 is essentially the top move. You can see a4, rook d1, and bishop e3 are basically equivalent. Rook d8. Yeah, now he plays b3, which is an inaccuracy. This is not an engine move for sure. Queen d7 takes. Now he goes a4, which is top. Bishop a3 is... Bishop e3 is, also not really the top move, but one of the top moves. Yeah, c4 is the top move. That move made me suspicious. The move c4 here is a really hard move to play. I mean, you're basically accepting that all of your pawns are going to be weak, and that's an incredibly high-level move. King f7, ab, cb. Now he goes rook a1, which is also the top move. Bishop b4 is also the top move. Yeah, this is incredibly suspicious. I mean, this move is also just not at the level of, 1200. But then he played f3, and we found a very, very nice move, rook a6. Oh, and king h2 is the top move, too. King h2, you can see, is like number 2. Now bishop c3. Now we did have d5 here, which maybe yielded slightly better chances here. b4 is inaccurate. But then he responds with the move king g3, which is the second move. And I should have gone patiently with the move rook b7. Instead, I took on b4, which leads to equality, and he plays rook d5. Very, very accurate. Yeah, I mean, look, I'll put it this way. Very, very high probability that he selectively cheated. He's 1274. Some of these moves were just, they were played on the level of a GM. Even queen e6 is a really nice move. Rook d1. b3 is another idea, like b3, a4, c4. Just extremely, high-level positional play in the endgame. Do I have evidence that is presentable in court? No, and that's what's very important to understand. It's like, that's why chess.com has their anti-cheating methods, and that's why if you believe someone is cheating, you should report them, and chess.com will investigate them. Another thing to realize is even if I report somebody, that doesn't mean that they're going to be necessarily accused. They're going to be necessarily convicted of it. Chess.com treats all accusations equally. Of course, I can streamline it, but it's not like anybody gets preferential treatment. Nor should anybody get preferential treatment. How sus is he? I would give it a 95% chance belief that he cheated. To me, that's what it seems like to me. Or that he's extremely underrated and, his actual rating should be 2,500. If it's a GM, I would believe it. But it's clearly not a GM because he plays at this level for most of his games. Okay. Yeah, I just want to be very, very clear about what I am saying, what I'm not saying. If he's listening to this And, you know, what I would hope is that even if he's listening to this, he would still understand where I'm coming from based on, you know, what I'm showing to be the engine moves. So, in any case, that was a pretty high-level game. I mean, it was Arai Lopez. Basically, as a result of the opening, we didn't get too many winning chances. Just the way that he played in the opening really shut me down. And, yeah, I guess we can look at his other games, or at least, let's look at his loss. Let's look at his loss. And let's see, like, what his opening play is like. Okay, so bishop d2. Okay, already he's black. He's black in this game. I mean, e5, e4. This guy's just good. Jesus. I mean, he is very good, but yeah, this game is also weird, but he lost it in the end. I mean, what is going on here? This rook is hanging on c3. I would guess his actual strength, if he's not cheating, is probably 23, 2400 standard. For sure. Okay, but look at this. Look at this. Bishop takes c3. No, I mean, obviously this is... I mean, he's just blundering all of his pieces. So, yeah, something is going on here, guys, but I don't really want to explore it further. I still think that was a good game, and there's definitely stuff to analyze, so I don't want to bog us down too much with that. It is what it is, guys, but I'm going to call it a night. I am exhausted. I'll see you guys later. Thanks again. Goodbye.